Hello everyone. Tonight we begin with a story soaked in velvet golden ink and the silent chill of a dynasty holding its breath before collapse. Imagine this, you're only 9 years old, and instead of toys or bedtime fairy tales, you're handed a crown still warm from the tyrant head of your father. Suddenly, you become the King of England. Sounds glorious, right? But don't be too quick to find it appealing. Because if you're Edward VI, the most pampered son of Henry VIII, what you inherit is not just a throne, but a cold, silent curse. The gilded halls of Hampton Court may be draped in silk and scented with incense, but they echo with expectations heavy as stone enough to crush the heart of a child. And trust me, if you think being royalty back then was heaven, you wouldn't have survived a day, even with room service. So before you relax and sink into tonight's tale, make sure to like the video and subscribe only if you truly enjoy what I'm sharing. And don't forget to leave a comment, letting me know where you're listening from and what time it is there. I love seeing how far these bedtime stories travel. Now dim the lights, turn on a gentle fan for a soft breeze in the background, and let's begin tonight's journey together. You're lying there, the dim light casting shadows across the ceiling. And maybe you're imagining something peaceful like an English meadow. But tonight, we're not in the grass. We're quietly gliding through the cold corridors of a Tudor palace. And there, a blonde child sits silently reading back straight as a candle. That's Edward VI, the only son of Henry VIII. A child raised not with the warmth of family, but under the pressure of an empire. From an early age, Edward didn't have his mother by his side. Jane Seymour Henry's third wife died just days after his birth. His father was too busy ruling, and when not ruling, busy marrying more wives. So Edward's childhood was filled not with affection, but with strict tutors, Latin lessons, and books thicker than the mattress you're lying on. It's no surprise people say he wrote essays against the Pope when he was just 10 years old. A child with extraordinary intellect, but starved of emotion. Strangely, even though he was kept strictly isolated from the world, he still wrote gentle letters to his sister Mary. In one letter, Edward called her the person I love most in the world, Hardmelm, right? And yet just a few years later, he tried to remove Mary from the line of succession with 3 trembling strokes of a pen on his deathbed. Royal affection, one could say, is more complicated than any Facebook relationship status. At just 6 years old, Edward was brought to live near his father at Hampton Court to begin learning to be king. While most kids were learning to tie their shoes, he was learning politics, theology, and military strategy. We may be relaxing here, but Edward had to memorize dozens of laws, quote the Bible in 3 languages, and endure a Latin tutor who was prone to rage and always kept a cane up his sleeve. Back then, academic excellence often came with a sore bottom. Historians still debate whether Edward truly grasped the depth of religion or simply echoed what adults drilled into him. But one thing is clear, he wasn't just a puppet. Records show that at the age of 12, Edward intervened in council decisions, crossing out phrases with too much holy connotation in oaths because they sounded too Catholic. You might be choosing a sleep playlist tonight, while this boy was choosing the theological direction of an entire kingdom. One lesser-known fact, Edward loved construction. During a royal progress, what we'd now call a state tour, he visited his father's forts, examined every stone, and ordered 2 to be torn down because they were ugly and poorly placed. Like an interior designer with the power to demolish buildings he didn't like. If you've ever procrastinated redecorating your bedroom, Edward might inspire you or make you feel a little lazy. But it was around this time that Edward's body began to betray him. After bouts of measles and influenza, his immune system was left barely functioning. In the winter of 1553, Edward started coughing up blood and vomiting dark fluids. Tudor medicine mostly relied on guesswork and luck. One doctor diagnosed him with corrupt vapors in the lungs, vague, but everyone agreed he was dying. Though his body was failing, Edward's mind remained sharp until the end. He sat up in bed trembling as he wrote a declaration that neither Mary nor Elizabeth should inherit the throne. Instead, it would go to Lady Jane Grey, a distant cousin with a seemingly more pure Protestant lineage. A shocking move, but very Edward. Historians still argue, was it a desperate personal decision? Or was he manipulated by figures like John Dudley to time that act? Plunged England into a succession crisis, and the result was that Jane was queen for only 9 days. After that, Mary took the throne, Jane was executed, and Edward became the most pitiful boy king in history. But to be blunt, had Edward lived longer, many scholars believe England might have turned into a different version of Switzerland, or according to some, a kind of militant Islamic-style theocracy. Hard to predict, but no one thinks it would have been peaceful and pleasant. A strange entry in Edward's private journal tells of him dissecting a hawk with his bare hands in a fit of rage. A gruesome scene, but it wasn't considered unusual at the time. Perhaps beneath the velvet robes and obedient phrases was a child bent by power and isolation. For Edward, being king wasn't a choice, it was something he could never refuse. And now you're still lying there, eyes growing heavier, maybe thinking, wow, being royalty doesn't sound so great. You're right. Being a king in the 16th century was like living in a survival game where you could die from infection, betrayal, or simply bad genetics. You can put your phone away now, or let the next story play automatically. But if you're still listening, thank you for joining Edward through a life without childhood, without choice, and without a happy ending. Now let's return to one of the saddest yet most important figures in Edward VI's short life, his mother, Jane Seymour. Still awake? If not, don't worry, Jane won't startle you. She was the third wife of Henry VIII, but the only one to bear him a son, and also the only one to die for a genuinely sad reason, not from beheading or disgrace. Yes, that's right, among a string of former wives discarded like outdated ornaments, Jane Seymour was the only one Henry mourned. Jane wasn't loud nor strikingly seductive like Anne Boleyn. In the few surviving portraits, she always appears with dull eyes and a reserved smile, as if always ready to politely step out of the frame. Perhaps it was that gentleness that made Henry feel she was more manageable than his previous wives. Sometimes, in order to survive the palace, knowing when to stay silent is a survival skill. But there's something history doesn't emphasize enough. Jane wasn't naive. She had served as lady-in-waiting to both of Henry's previous wives, meaning she had seen Anne Boleyn's blood stain the stone floor, and before that, the ruin of a marriage with Catherine of Aragon. When Jane accepted Henry's proposal, she knew exactly what she was getting into. Some historians even suggest she played the role of saintly woman strategically to win the king's heart and trust. It must also be said, Henry loved Jane more than any other wife. Not because she was more beautiful, not because she was more intelligent, but because she gave him something no one else did, a son, an heir. The most precious jewel in the kingdom, as he called Edward. Sadly, the price of that gift was the mother's life. Jane died just 12 days after Edward's birth, likely from postpartum complications, possibly fever or blood loss. In an age where childbirth was like flipping a coin with death, Jane drew the wrong side. When she died, the court was plunged into mourning, at least on paper. Henry, the man who had beheaded wives, cast others aside, and collected marriages like stamps, genuinely mourned Jane for 3 years. No remarriage, no festivities. And when he died, he chose to be buried beside Jane in the royal tomb. Romantic, maybe? Or maybe just convenient. But let's not question too much. This is still a bedtime story. What few know is that Edward never got to see his mother's face. No portraits, no keepsakes were left in his hands. As he grew older, he never spoke of her, not because he didn't love her, but because he didn't know how. How do you grieve someone you've never seen? Someone who only exists through the nostalgic glances of others. Historians still debate the psychological impact of losing his mother so early on Edward. Some believe that absence made him cold, rational, and rarely expressive. But there are also records showing he was often gentle with older women, especially his sisters. Perhaps somewhere inside him there remained an instinct to seek the shadow of the mother he never truly knew. One interesting detail often overlooked in official ceremonies, Edward always referred to Jane Seymour as the only queen. Though brief, her influence far outlasted her life. She was the doorway that led a child to the throne and then slammed shut forever. If Jane had lived, English history might have turned out very differently. What do you think? A mother who appeared only in the earliest days of her child's life, yet forever altered the course of the Tudor dynasty. A woman whose silence spoke the loudest. She didn't need to do much, just give birth to a king, then quietly vanish like a fading dream in golden light. Do you ever feel that the greatest people are sometimes the ones nobody remembers the face of? If you're still awake, maybe you should thank Jane. Without her, we wouldn't have had a story to tell tonight. Still lying there, the fan humming, your eyes growing heavier, but don't fall asleep just yet. Because right now, the golden boy of the Tudor Empire, Edward VI, is ascending the throne. Not with applause, not with joyous smiles, but with the heavy silence of nobles wondering who will really rule. Henry VIII died on January 28, 1547. He was so overweight that his body had to be lifted with pulleys to be placed on the bed. A rather undignified death. But more importantly, the throne now belonged to a 9-year-old boy, pale with golden hair and eyes that still held a glimmer of innocence, at least then. Edward didn't climb onto the throne the way you climb into bed. His coronation took place on February 20th of the same year. He was dressed in a red cloak so heavy that 3 attendants had to hold it up from behind. If you think wearing winter pajamas is a struggle, imagine trying to balance on a throne while wearing something twice your weight. Of course, as a child, Edward couldn't rule on his own. So, who ruled? Henry VIII left a regency council of 16 nobles. But as usual in politics, the council lasted only a few days before one man seized control, Edward Seymour, the boy's uncle, who quickly named himself Lord Protector, which means essentially Henry died. Seymour took power and Edward continued his studies. But what did he study? Records show Edward continued being trained to be an ideal king, which meant learning politics to know who was lying to him, scripture to justify executions, diplomacy to pretend to like people he hated, and military cartography, because apparently no one thought he needed time for Lego. There's a strange but true fact: Edward loved keeping a journal. And not that today was sunny, I felt a little sad kind. He recorded political events in a tone as cold as stone. For example, when his uncle executed his own brother Edward's, other Uncle Edward simply wrote, "Thomas Seymour was executed today." No exclamation point, no emotion, not a single tear. Historians still argue, was Edward truly unfeeling, or just trying to survive in a world too cruel for a child? Some believe he was the product of overconditioning and early emotional loss. Others think he was a true mini Henry VIII, programmed to be firm, detached, and devoted to religious ideals above all else. Health-wise, things weren't great. From a young age, Edward was often sick, frequent coughing, fevers, fatigue. But no one dared to say it out loud, because a king must always be healthy to represent the strength of the nation. One time, Edward's face and neck became swollen. The courtiers blamed it on eating too many oranges. You heard that right. Oranges. Royal illnesses were sometimes explained in the most citrusy ways. In reality, Edward suffered many ailments quietly. But that didn't stop him from becoming remarkably serious and independent at a young age. Around age 13, he began sending orders to advisors, amending laws, and making decisions that left even seasoned council members stunned. In one letter to the Privy Council, he personally crossed out the words Holy Virgin Mother from a ceremony because it sounds too Catholic. That's right, a teenager editing the national religion. Policy-wise, Edward led the charge in solidifying Protestantism in England. He supported sweeping reforms, and under his reign, many churches removed their saint statues. Latin rituals were replaced with English, and the Catholic aesthetic was swapped for the austere simplicity of Protestantism. Some say that had Edward lived longer, England wouldn't have just been a Protestant nation, but an intensely strict one that bordered on frightening. Here's something few know: Edward had a fascination with finance. Records show him sitting with tax officials, inspecting every coin in the treasury, worried that if we continue spending like this next year, we won't have enough to buy weapons. In other words, at 14, he was already worrying about national deficit. Meanwhile, most kids that age are just worried about asking their parents for snack money. Do you feel sorry for him? Or a bit unsettled that such a young mind operated like a miniature political machine? Maybe both. Edward VI, though only a child, had to be king. And not just any king, but a standardized version of Henry VIII. Edward wasn't a reigning king in the way you'd imagine. No intense throne room meetings, no dramatic table slamming like in epic films. What Edward had was Willpower Inc. and a bunch of advisors squabbling like hungry cats around a bowl of royal soup. From the very beginning of the reign, most of the power was held by Edward Seymour, Edward's uncle. Officially, Seymour was the Lord Protector, the king's guardian. But in reality, he acted more like a substitute emperor, granting himself titles, doling out favors, and even launching a war against Scotland. At one point, he ordered troops to burn down Edinburgh to mark the wrath of God. You know, the kind of remembering that involves setting everything on fire. While Seymour used royal power to build his own legacy, Edward began doing something few expected: documenting everything. Not to study, but to observe, as if he were silently categorizing every adult in his notebook: who to trust, who to fear. He wrote in his own hand, not through a scribe. A sign that even as a child, Edward understood the role of a monarch and the snakes slithering around the throne. It's worth noting Edward did not rule by emotion. He didn't care for mistresses' poetry or royal banquets. Instead, he was passionate about law, religion, and reform. And you know what? In a country confused by years of shifting between Catholicism and Anglicanism, schism and unity, Edward became the first to try to rationalize a nation's faith. He commissioned leading theologians to draft the Book of Common Prayer, a text written in English, accessible, and meant to replace the ornate Latin rituals. For the first time in history, ordinary people could understand what was being said during church services. It sounds simple, but in the 16th century, that was a spiritual revolution. Imagine going to church your entire life without understanding a word, and then one day, it all becomes as clear as a Zalo message marked "Seen." But every reform comes at a cost. Traditional Catholics felt insulted, and riots broke out in the west and north of England. In some places, people stormed churches, smashed the new altars, and screamed for the return of the Virgin Mary statues. In response, Edward's army did not embrace peace. They cracked down hard, leaving hundreds dead. And in the boy king's diary, the event was described simply as, "A rebellion was put down." There were casualties, not a word of regret. Historians still debate, was Edward a radical religious reformer, or just a boy brainwashed by extreme advisors because he didn't stop at mild reform? He once sought to abolish the Eucharist, entirely remove all church paintings, and turn England into a Western version of Calvin's Geneva. One historian compared Edward to a Martin Luther, who didn't get the chance to grow up full of passion, full of ambition, and slightly naive in politics. Outside of religion, Edward was also deeply interested in finance and law. When he noticed inflation rising and coins being debased, he called for monetary reform. When overlapping laws confused the public, he requested a simplified legal code so anyone could learn it if they were diligent. It sounds like you're reading a Tudor-era version of Adam Grant's Think Again. Here's a detail few mention. Edward banned summer hunting not out of love for animals, but because it costs the royal treasury too much. He recorded every expense, every pound of meat, every barrel of ale. A child more frugal than most modern ministers. If you've ever thought kids don't know anything well, Edward knew, and often knew more than most adults at the time. What truly set Edward apart was this: he didn't rule by symbolism, but by system. In a court used to sword-waving, shouting, and beheadings to assert authority, Edward maintained a quiet, cold, and calculated demeanor, like a Swiss watch. This story may not be as flashy as executions or affairs, but it's the real breath of power, where silence can replace 1,000 swords. Still listening? Good, stay still. Pull your blanket a little tighter, because we're about to journey into a very specific period in England the moment the country fell into the hands of a boy. And you'll see, under Edward VIII, England was nothing like the reign of his famous father, Henry VIII. Not different in size, but in soul. When Henry VIII ruled England, felt like a grand stage where the rotund king played every role at once. Warrior, self-proclaimed Pope lover, traitor, and director. He did everything loudly, dramatically, and often bloodily. Henry created the Church of England just to get a divorce. He seized church property, beheaded friends, executed ex-wives, and married 6 times. His reign was a tragic comedy with the tragedy part often ending in an axe. But when Edward took the throne, the stage fell silent. No more royal feasts, no more extravagant hunts. England was no longer a painting splashed with blood and personal passion. It became a blueprint drafted by a boy who loved books and despised anything illogical. Henry's reign was the age of impulse. He ruled by desire, revenge, pride. Edward ruled with cold reason, even mechanical precision. One historian once said, if Henry was a volcano erupting, Edward was an iceberg, quiet, but capable of sinking a ship. Let's look at the 2 clearest points of comparison: religion and politics. Henry VIII established the Church of England, but in truth, he retained many Catholic elements, rituals, vestments, hierarchical structures. He only changed the boss of the church from the Pope to himself. People call it a political reform, not a spiritual one. Edward number. He wanted a full cleansing. Under Edward's reign, saint statues were smashed, altars, dismantled, Latin sermons replaced with English, and the Book of Common Prayer was enforced nationwide. It was the first time English people actually understood what they were reading in church. For Edward, faith wasn't meant to be admired, it was meant to be understood. Henry used religion as a weapon to seize power. Edward used it as a compass to guide a nation. He might have been young, but what happened under his reign shaped the religious identity of England for generations. Politically, Henry ruled by fear. He punished anyone who defied him, bishop, advisor, or even the wife he'd professed love for the day before. Under Henry, betrayal was punished like a sacred right. Even the loyal weren't safe. Edward, too young to behave like a tyrant, he chose to restructure the system. Instead of personalizing power, he pushed for reform in laws, finance, and court management through documentation. The court under Edward saw less wine, fewer weapons, and far more paperwork. England under Edward resembled a company undergoing restructuring, whereas under Henry, it felt like a tearful opera. At one point, Edward even proposed to canceling costly festivals to save the budget. If Henry spent money to display power, Edward counted every coin like a grumpy old accountant. And remember, he was only 13 or 14 at the time. Here's a detail few notice. Henry loved building lavish palaces, Hampton Court, Whitehall, none such palace. Edward, meanwhile, was obsessed with coastal fortifications. The father adored grandeur. The son thought of practicality, control, and defense. Yet there's a tragic irony. Despite being intelligent, reform-minded, and disciplined, Edward didn't live long enough to see his foundation solidify. He died at age 15. And as soon as he passed, everything he had carefully built began to unravel. Mary, with the sister he once loved and later tried to remove, took the throne and reversed all Protestant reforms. The saint statues returned. Latin came back, and blood was shed once more. Some say Henry VIII shattered Catholicism in England with a punch. Edward VI tried to rebuild a new spiritual framework with meticulous strokes. But in the end, neither could bring lasting stability. One left behind too large a shadow. The other left an unfinished manuscript. Which one do you think left the deeper mark? You probably see now being a king doesn't only require power, it requires time. And Edward didn't have that second thing. You're breathing slower now, aren't you? Good. Then let me take you even deeper. Not into the palace, not into royal parliaments, but into the muddy roads, the thatched cottages, the marketplaces filled with smoke and sweat. Today we'll talk about what life was like for ordinary people under Edward VI, the young king with a cold heart and a powerful pen. And trust me, you'll see that no matter how clever the king is, the people still had to struggle with fields, hunger, and fear. Imagine you're a farmer living on the outskirts of Norfolk in 1549. You wake up at dawn, not from an alarm, but from the rooster's crow and your empty stomach. Your day begins by stoking the fire, baking black bread hard as bricks, and boiling thin porridge if there's still some oats left in the house. Under Edward, most common folk were vegetarians by necessity. Meat was a luxury. Occasionally, you'd have a bit of old salted pork or cheese so hard it had to be cut with a knife. Water wasn't drunk straight from the river. You drank weak ale not to get drunk, but because it was safer than water. Your home. A single-room thatched hut with wattle and daub walls, dirt floors, no glass windows, no toilet. If you lived near the city, you might hear the cries of fishmongers, footsteps clapping on stone, or church chants now in English, not the foreign Latin. Did you know that in 1549, just 2 years after Edward became king, peasant revolts erupted all over the country? The reason simple: enclosure. The nobility began fencing off lands that had once been common. Where villagers grazed cattle, grew food, gathered firewood. They turned these shared fields into private pastures for sheep because wool was more profitable than wheat. The result? The poor lost land, lost livelihood, and they rebelled. The most notable was Kett's Rebellion in Norfolk, where thousands of people set up camp, reclaimed enclosed lands, and demanded the king return the right to live. Here's the strange part: they still hung portraits of Edward in their camp. They didn't oppose the king, they believed he was good, but surrounded by bad men. A naive and tragic faith. The rebellion was crushed. Nearly 900 people were killed. In his diary, Edward wrote just one line: rebellion suppressed. 900 dead. As simple as ticking off a to-do list item. Cold, emotionless, and it continued just like that. Under Edward's reign, religious changes didn't just unfold in the court. They struck every church, every village, every altar of the devout. Saint statues were torn down. Stained glass windows were replaced with empty panes. Sacred Latin rites, once seen as the voice of God, were now spoken in plain English. And you know what's strange? The common folk weren't sure whether they were celebrating or sinning. Elders whispered to each other. Not reading Latin might be heresy. The young asked, puzzled, does this mean our grandparents believed wrong? Historians still debate whether common people under Edward truly converted or simply pretended to survive. England at the time was running out of money. The war with Scotland, reform expenses, and corruption sent prices skyrocketing. A loaf of bread that cost 1 penny in 1540 could double by 1550. Silver was removed from coins to cut minting costs, leading to inflation. And who paid the price? You did. The people. Those living by the coin, counting every penny. There was even a popular joke at the time: God gives us wheat, but the crown turns it into dust in our purse. Yet amid this gloomy picture, there was light. The first schools teaching in English were founded. Some ordinary people read the Bible in their own language for the first time. A new class, literate, thoughtful questioning began to emerge. You, if born under Edward's reign, might still die of the flu. But if lucky enough to learn a little, you could read the law, understand sermons, and for the first time in centuries, you wouldn't need a mediator to speak to God. So there it is, under a king who never saw his mother's face, who ruled while still shedding his schoolboy cloak, England both transformed and bled. For the common people, it wasn't a golden age, but it wasn't hell either. It was a time when English identity began to awaken quietly, contentiously, and with nothing guaranteed. Still with me? If so, stay silent, because tonight, well, turn the pages of dusty old books, not filled with battles or cathedrals, but with the subtle threads that shaped a nation's fate, England's foreign relations under King Edward VI. It may sound as dry as a press briefing, but don't worry. He'll tell it in a way that doesn't require a velvet robe to understand. Just pull your blanket up a little more and imagine you're in a cold stone room in Windsor Castle, listening to a 10-year-old boy trying to uphold international dignity with a letter in perfect Latin. Under his father, Henry VIII, England, sometimes allied with France, other times fought like cats and dogs. But by the time Edward took the throne, that relationship was in free fall. From the very start of the reign, the English still occupied a strategic city called Boulogne on the northern coast of France, a thorn in the French side. And of course, the French didn't forget it. They declared war and retook surrounding areas, leaving Edward and his council flustered like a teenager who's been seen but left unread. The result, a reluctant peace treaty was signed in 1550. England returned Boulogne in exchange for a large sum of money described in records as 400,000 crowns. For Edward, who was counting every penny from an empty treasury, money mattered more than pride. A practical decision, though, seen by nobles as a sign of weakness. Historians still debate this. Did Edward truly want peace for the sake of stability? Or was he simply forced to concede because there was no money left to keep fighting? No one has a definitive answer, but it seems the boy understood the power of a budget better than political slogans. Yes, you heard right. Under King Edward VI, England tried to marry Edward to the Queen of Scotland, who was also just a child, Mary Stuart. Sounds romantic, but it was in fact a coercive political marriage known by the oddly poetic name rough wooing. Under the rule of Lord Protector Sir Edward's Uncle, English forces invaded Scotland, burned villages, destroyed fortresses, and killed all with the goal of forcing the Scots to agree that Mary would marry Edward when they came of age. You heard correctly. They tried to propose with war. And the result? The Scots would rather marry Mary off to a French prince than send her to the Tudors. She was sent to France betrothed to the Dauphin, and just like that, the cross-border love story went up in smoke. The rough wooing campaign embarrassed many in England and drained national finances further. A costly lesson in sword-based diplomacy, especially when you're too broke to buy armor. Now, for the interesting part. In the eyes of Europe's great dynasties like the Habsburgs in Spain or the German principalities, England under Edward was an oddity, a child on the throne pushing radical Protestant reforms, yet somehow remaining politically stable. They couldn't believe England hadn't collapsed. And that worried them, especially Emperor Charles V, head of the Holy Roman Empire, uncle to Mary Tudor and a staunch Catholic. Charles was furious that his niece had been removed from the line of succession and unsettled by England spreading Protestantism like a viral idea. So while no wars broke out, diplomatic relations remained cold. Ambassadors from other nations frequently reported back that Edward appears weak, yet strangely hasn't fallen. Scholars today still ask, was it Edward's calm and rational demeanor that discouraged aggression? Or were other nations simply too caught up in their own problems to stop England from doing as it pleased? Either way, Edward's time saw no major wars, but also no strong alliances. It was a period of England pulling inward, rebuilding its walls, rewriting its laws, and waiting. One thing you should know, Edward nearly had a wife. In fact, several near marriages. At one point, the council proposed marrying him to Elizabeth of Valois, a French princess, as a way to reconcile after the Boulogne Treaty. On another occasion, they considered a princess from Savoy, then various Protestant German princesses. But no one wanted to marry a dying king. You can imagine the private meeting, "Our princess requires a strong husband." Well, Edward is very intelligent and obedient. But he's been coughing for 3 months. No weddings happened, no treaties were signed, and England remained pinned on the map of Europe like an island, marked awaiting recovery. So you see, England under Edward VI wasn't loud expansionist or shaking the world, but it didn't collapse either. That 9-year-old boy on the throne kept the ship from sinking in the wake of Henry VIII's storm and with the looming tempest of Mary on the horizon. Edward's diplomacy not grand, but remarkably intelligent. It was the quiet calculation of someone who knew to last long. First, you have to survive. Edward grew up without a mother and almost without a father. But he had something many of his peers did not: elite education. From age 5, he was taught Latin, Greek, French theology, mathematics, logic, rhetoric, Roman law philosophy, and the Bible. And not just for fun, his tutors were some of the greatest scholars in Europe. They saw him as a scholar king, a reincarnated Augustus. And strangely, Edward liked it. He read Plato while his peers were learning to write. He wrote philosophical essays while other noble children were learning to ride horses. And most importantly, he understood the deep role of education, not just for himself, but for the entire nation. One of Edward VI's greatest legacies, ushering in the first golden age of secondary education in England. That's right. Instead of building more castles, he built schools. In just a few short years of rule, at least 35 grammar schools were founded or restructured under Edward's name. Many of them still exist today. You can find schools named King Edward's Schools scattered across England. What did these schools teach? Mainly Latin ethics and classical literature, enough to train a generation of Protestant citizens who could read, think, and obey the law. It sounds strict, but for that era, it was a quiet revolution. Edward understood that education wasn't just about knowing how to read. It was about knowing what to believe according to Protestant ideals. Under his reign, the Book of Common Prayer was published for the first time in English, and it was mandated to be taught, read aloud, and printed across the land. For the first time in English history, people could understand the prayers they repeated every day. No more cryptic Latin, no more dependency on the clergy. And here's the key point: Edward wanted the people to understand their faith, not just obey it. To him, Protestantism wasn't a slogan. It was a reasonable moral foundation, something that could be debated and learned. Of course, not everyone welcomed the idea of a literate population. Many nobles of the time feared that if the people could read the Bible, write petitions, and do calculations, they would no longer be obedient. But Edward was unmoved. He opposed the idea of keeping people ignorant to control them. That's why many modern scholars refer to Edward as the initiator of basic public literacy in England, a teenager with the vision of a civilized reformer. Edward also pushed for new legislation to standardize teaching content from Bible curricula to the operation of schools. He required local bishops to oversee teaching in both churches and schools to ensure unity in doctrine and belief. It might not sound exciting, but this was the earliest form of a nationally supervised education system, and it started with a coughing boy on the throne. Yes, like everything in history, education under Edward VI wasn't entirely pure. Some historians argue the building of schools, distribution of books, and teaching of doctrine were really tools to control minds through knowledge. In other words, Edward didn't educate to liberate, but to direct. But others counter, regardless of motive, raising public literacy was a giant leap forward in a time when 90% of Europe's population was illiterate. After Edward's death, many of the schools remained. Some were suppressed by Mary I, his sister and successor, but she couldn't erase them all. And when Elizabeth I took the throne afterward, she inherited and expanded Edward's education model, laying the foundation for a modern literate England. Edward may have only lived to 15, but in 6 brief years of rule, he planted a seed that 500 years later, the world is still harvesting. In the winter of 1552, people noticed Edward was coughing more often, growing weaker, visibly thinner. Court ladies whispered, "The king doesn't eat like he used to." Doctors, known as physicians, then though, really just a step above fortune tellers, diagnosed him with a cold. But this was no ordinary cold. By February 1553, Edward was coughing blood, and worse, he began vomiting a dark green-black fluid. People of the time didn't understand that his lungs were rotting. They simply called it a poisonous vapor within. And then they began to hide the king's illness. Final days, still writing, still ruling. Though Edward's body weakened, his mind remained astonishingly sharp. He didn't lie passively in bed. He continued writing, issuing orders, amending laws, and most controversially, rewriting the succession. Henry VIII had arranged that after Edward, the crown would pass to Mary, his daughter, with Catherine of Aragon, a Catholic, and if Mary died childless, then to Elizabeth. A simple plan, but Edward could not accept it. Mary was Catholic. To Edward, this wasn't just a difference in belief, it was a threat to everything he had built. A Protestant England could not fall into the hands of a Catholic queen. So from his sickbed, with a trembling hand, Edward drafted a document titled, "My Device for the Succession." At first he wrote that the crown would go to the son of Lady Jane Grey, a Tudor descendant purely Protestant. But then he realized Jane had no son. So with 3 clumsy strokes of ink, Edward crossed out the son of and rewrote it as Lady Jane and her male heirs. A small moment, but one that changed the entire course of English history. Alone, silent, and forgotten. As his condition worsened, Edward was moved to Greenwich Palace, quieter, more secluded. Very few were allowed to see the king. Even Mary and Elizabeth, his beloved sisters, were not formally informed. Because the court feared that if word spread Edward was dying, all plans for succession would collapse immediately. Imagine it, a 15-year-old boy swollen with purplish skin and hollow cheeks, still trying to smile when someone entered the room. Records describe Edward's eyes as bright, but his skin pale and taut like fish skin. A sight no one wanted to see, especially in a monarch still technically a child. Strangely, no one dared tell Edward directly that he was dying. But Edward knew. And he did not cry, did not fear. He simply asked the chaplains to pray in English, just as he had once required for all the people. His final words and death, July 6th, 1553. No trumpets, no public funeral. Edward VI, the young king, the scholar king who opened schools, wrote prayer books, and reshaped the national religion, drew his last breath in silence. His final words, as recorded by a servant, were, "I am glad to die." A whisper soft as a door closing in a rainy night. No one truly knows why he said it. Was it because he was tired? Because he feared Mary would undo all he had built? Or simply because he was a boy who never had a childhood? Funeral and political intrigue. After Edward's death, the news was kept secret for 3 days. During that time, the Privy Council did everything in its power to place Lady Jane Grey on the throne, following the device Edward had left behind. And they succeeded at least for 9 days. But as you know, true power doesn't lie in ink on paper, but in the support of the people and the army. When Mary declared herself the rightful queen, the public surged behind her like a wave. Jane was deposed. Mary took the crown. Today, Edward VI is rarely mentioned. He is often grouped with weak kings who died young and left little behind. But the truth is different. He was England's first truly Protestant monarch. He built schools, he reformed laws, he rationalized religion, and he did it all before turning 16. Some historians call Edward the sower of seeds that Elizabeth I would later harvest. Others call him the youngest king with the greatest mind England ever had. Edward died on July 6, 1553, at age 15, but wasn't buried until August 8th, more than a month later. Why the delay? Because England was plunged into political chaos. While Edward's body lay embalmed and guarded in Whitehall Palace outside, a fierce power struggle raged between Lady Jane Grey and Mary Tudor. During that time, no one dared announce the king's death immediately, because doing so meant giving up the advantage. A dead king meant an empty throne, and whoever claimed it first would win. And so, Edward was left waiting in the shadows, like a secret no one dared reveal. The first and last Protestant royal funeral. On August 8, 1553, Edward VI was finally laid to rest. The funeral was held at Westminster Abbey, the traditional burial place of English monarchs. By then, Mary Tudor had reclaimed the crown and was already planning to restore Catholicism. But because Edward's funeral had already been arranged under Protestant rites, she did not interfere. And so, for the first time and for the last time in a long while, a royal funeral was conducted entirely in English. No Latin, no Catholic Mass, no saintly icons. Every prayer, every hymn, every farewell was based on the Book of Common Prayer, the very book Edward VI had sponsored and published in his lifetime. So even though his body was gone, his words still echoed through every verse. Guests at the funeral silent, cold, and cautious. Not many attended the funeral. Of course, there were nobles, bishops, and court representatives. But their presence wasn't for mourning, it was to signal political alignment. A young king had just died. A new queen had just risen. And no one wanted to misstep, even with a glance. Mary, his half-sister, did not attend. Elizabeth, his other half-sister, was not formally invited. And the people, they didn't know whether to wear mourning for a dead king or celebration for a new queen. A strange atmosphere cloaked the ceremony, solemn yet artificial, sacred yet political, grave hidden among cold stone. Edward VI was buried north of the high altar at Westminster Abbey, in a tomb with no statue, no relief, no stone pillar. He was laid to rest beside his mother Jane Seymour, as Henry VIII had once wished. Ironically, Henry himself never received a proper tomb either. And so father and son, one who struck fear across Europe, and one who reformed an entire nation through thought, lay in ruthless simplicity. No stone monument stood over Edward for centuries. Only a brass plate installed in the 19th century bears his identity. Under this pavement lies Edward VI, the only son of Henry VIII. Died 1553. No praise, no lamentation. Afterwards, only darkness. Immediately after Edward's funeral, Mary began her campaign to re-Catholicize England. The Book of Common Prayer was banned. Protestant clergy were executed. What Edward had built in 6 years was set aflame in months. Even records of his funeral were restricted. No one was to speak of Edward as a Protestant saint. No one was to remember him as a wise young king. He was erased from the national memory as if he had never been. But did the light truly die? Edward VI's funeral may not have been grand. His tomb may be unremarkable. His name may be skipped in textbooks. But his legacy, education, the language of prayer, love of learning, the rationalization of belief lives on in the systems England still uses today. like a candle that never blazed, but burned just enough to help someone else find the way. So if you're lying there, eyes half closed, thinking about the funeral of a boy who once was king, remember this: some souls don't need statues to leave a mark. And perhaps the quietest funerals are the most unforgettable endings. All right, you're still there, listening to my voice as steady as the wind slipping through a late-night window. Stay still, don't open your eyes, because we're about to enter a chapter of chaos, a turning point not as quiet as the death of a young king, but as violent as an underground storm ripping at the roots of a kingdom. After Edward VI took his last breath, England didn't fall silent in mourning. It trembled with unrest, conflict, and collapse. Edward's death wasn't just the passing of a boy raised to be king. It was the temporary fall of a new model of England, rational Protestant reformist and civilized by ink and thought. And the moment that candle was snuffed out, the shadows of the past surged across the realm. The Privy Council, those who held real power in Edward's court, did everything they could to preserve his legacy. They acted on the only thing they believed could save the whole project, to enforce the device for the succession Edward had left behind. In it, the crown would go to Lady Jane Grey, a Tudor relative, a model Protestant, intelligent and tragically unlucky. Lady Jane was placed on the throne on July 10, 1553, just 4 days after Edward's secret death. But the people hardly knew who she was. She wasn't a daughter of Henry VIII. She wasn't a name ever mentioned in church. She was a distant shadow propped up hastily, then swept away like an old stage curtain. 9 days later, Mary Tudor, Edward's older sister, the one he had removed from the line of succession, marched into London. No battle, no bloodshed, because the people backed her, and not because they adored Mary, but because they were tired of unclear bloodlines suddenly producing kings and queens. They wanted something solid. They wanted the Tudor name, and Mary was the last of the official line. On July 19th, Lady Jane was deposed. "Mary, I took the throne," to the cheers of the crowd. And so, the reign begun by a child with a rational vision was replaced by a woman raised in sorrow, loneliness, and deep Catholic faith. England once again spun the wheel in the opposite direction. Immediately upon taking power, Mary began reversing her brother's reforms. The Book of Common Prayer was banned. Protestant clergy were hunted down. Churches returned to Latin. Those who once preached Protestant doctrine were executed, sometimes in public squares. Some were burned alive. Some were beheaded. Some disappeared without a trace. Under Edward, England moved forward in silence. Under Mary, it screamed in reverse. Economically, things didn't improve either. War with France resumed. Currency continued to devalue. And on a bitter winter night in 1558, Mary died childless without a Catholic successor. And the crown passed to Elizabeth I, Edward's half-sister, once labeled a legitimate bastard. Now you might be asking yourself, what remained from Edward's reign if Mary burned, killed, and erased it all was Edward? Nothing but a sorrowful note in the chaotic Tudor symphony numb. Because Elizabeth, the woman who would rule England for over 40 years, did not forget her half-brother. She inherited what Mary missed, but rebuilt the religious foundation in a more moderate direction, still Protestant, but not extreme. Still reformist, but not dogmatic. She never said it directly, but later historians all agree Elizabeth completed what Edward had started. So yes, England, after Edward, may have stumbled, bled and spun in crisis. But it was also a time when the nation learned to negotiate its faith, to choose between scripture and politics, between loyalty and survival. In the 1560s, as the school system Edward once envisioned began to grow, as the first children prayed in English in church, people began to remember there once was a king, young, quiet, often coughing, who killed no one, married no one, built no towers, or waged wars. He simply studied, wrote, reformed, and died. And strangely, because he never lived long enough to make grave mistakes, he came to be seen as the one who laid the first brick for a more rational, more literate, more questioning England. Now you can breathe evenly again, because this chapter has passed. England after Edward may have been chaotic, may have bled, but it also healed like a body after fever, like a mind after a bad dream. So, if you dream tonight, dream of a king who held a pen, not a sword. And if you wake up, know this: not every young king is forgotten. Some live only 15 years and leave traces that stretch 5 centuries beyond. And yet one question lingers in history, like an unhealable headache. Why did Mary Edward VI's half-sister and the lawful heir to the English throne, according to Henry VIII's final will, get struck from the line of succession by her own younger brother? This isn't just a political tale. It's a Tudor tragedy where faith, ambition, and betrayal weave together like embroidery on the cloak of destiny. Mary was the eldest daughter of Henry VIII and his first queen, Catherine of Aragon. She had been disinherited when her father broke from Catholicism and declared his first marriage void. But after years of disgrace, Mary was restored in both title and succession rights, along with her half-sister Elizabeth, through harsh conditions in Henry VIII's final testament. And yet less than a decade later, as Edward lay dying, Mary was once again erased. The reason wasn't familial affection, it lay deeper in religion and power. Edward VI, though still a teenager when he came to the throne, was a Protestant zealot to his core. He was raised on severe sermons about the purity of Reformed faith and saw Catholicism as a stain on England's sacred vestments. Mary, by contrast, was a devout Catholic who refused to abandon the Latin Mass and even declined to attend English-language services, one of Edward's key reforms. If Mary became queen, everything Edward had built would collapse like a candle tower in winter wind. But Edward didn't act alone. In his final years, he was surrounded by powerful Protestant advisors, chief among them John Dudley, Duke of Northumberland. Dudley feared not only the undoing of reforms, but also for his own life if Mary took power and held him accountable for England's radical religious policies. So he persuaded Edward to revise the line of succession, removing both Mary and Elizabeth, who had both once been declared illegitimate, and replacing them with a distant cousin, Lady Jane Grey. Jane was devout and easier to manage, or so they thought. Of course, the illegitimacy argument was a convenient excuse. Everyone knew Henry VIII had annulled his marriage to Mary's mother Catherine and later to Elizabeth's mother Anne Boleyn. Though he later restored their titles, the legal stain remained. Edward and his faction didn't hesitate to use that lawful blade to cut both formidable women out of the path to the crown. The problem was Mary wasn't someone easily brushed aside. When Edward died and Lady Jane Grey was proclaimed Queen, England froze in shock. But just 9 days later, Mary had rallied enough support to march on London like an autumn storm, overthrow Jane, declare her own claim, and punish those who had tried to erase her from history. This event, a brutal reversal in succession politics, didn't just end the dream of Edward's Protestant extremism. It ushered in a tear-stained chapter of Mary's own making. But that is a story for another night. If you're still awake now, close your eyes and imagine yourself standing in the gray stone corridors of Hampton Court Palace, where vows and schemes still echo in the shadows of time. Jane ruled for 9 days. 9 days of unrest, 9 days of political confusion. And then Mary, daughter of Catherine of Aragon, returned, carrying the weight of legitimacy and a burning faith. They tried to stop her. But Mary rode across the countryside, welcomed by nobles and commoners alike. Catholic banners flew, bells rang out. Crowds cheered not just for a Tudor, but for the rightful daughter of a true queen. Before summer ended, Jane was imprisoned in the Tower of London, and Mary, once declared illegitimate, was proclaimed Queen Mary I of England. What followed is the reason her name still lingers in legends and mirrors. Mary didn't just reclaim a throne, she came to restore a faith. Over the years, she had watched her father dismantle the Roman Church, brick by brick, and her brother tear it down to the ground. With the crown on her head, Mary didn't see triumph. she saw duty to God, to the soul of England, and to her mother's memory. Thus began a period some call righteous restoration. Others call it a reign of terror. Mary's first order of business: repeal every religious reform since her father's time. The Latin Mass was reinstated. Married priests were expelled. Most crucially, the heresy laws were revived, allowing executions of those who denied Catholic doctrine. This is when blood began to flow. Between 1555 and 1558, nearly 300 Protestants were burned alive by Mary's command. These were men, women, even elderly clergy who had once served under Henry. The flames at Smithfield became a familiar sight. Londoners who once cheered Mary's rise began to avoid the smoke-filled squares. One of the most infamous executions was that of Hugh Latimer and Nicholas Ridley, two former bishops who refused to renounce their Protestant faith. As the flames rose, Latimer was said to cry out, "We shall this day light such a candle in England as I trust shall never be put out." Some historians believe Mary thought she was saving souls, not taking lives. Others argue she was manipulated by advisors or too deeply wounded. She had seen her mother cast aside herself, declared illegitimate, and her faith treated as treason. Still, the executions continued. Archbishop Thomas Cranmer, who had annulled her mother's marriage and authored the Book of Common Prayer, was the final victim. A perfectly symbolic revenge. So was Mary a tyrant, or simply a wounded woman trying to heal England in the only way she knew? Modern historians remain divided. Some label her a fanatic. Others view her as a tragic figure in an age when power was upheld by fire and fear as much as law. Throughout this time, Mary's health declined. She longed for a child, but it never happened. On several occasions, she believed herself pregnant only to be left with a swollen belly and a shattered heart. Her husband Philip II of Spain spent more time abroad than by her side, and the people grew increasingly wary of foreign influence. By the time Mary died in 1558, her dream of a Catholic England had begun to crumble. Her successor, none other than Elizabeth, the daughter of Anne Boleyn, whom Mary had once refused to acknowledge. The flames had died, but the ashes remained. And Mary, the first queen crowned in England as an independent woman, was buried like a monarch. But in the memory of many, she would forever be the name that made the air colder. Bloody Mary. But was that blood of her own spilling? Or merely the ink of history written by the victors? Reflect on that as the candle flickers and the footsteps of the Tudors fade into the night. Mary Tudor, known by that fearsome name, Bloody Mary, was not born a monster. But if you grow up in the court of a father like Henry VIII, perhaps you too would find it hard to escape a fate steeped in blood. So let me take you back to another beginning, where it all started with her father, the most famous and infamous king of England, Henry VIII. Henry was no dull monarch. In fact, he was almost the definition of Tudor drama. 6 wives, 2 messy divorces, and 2 executions so quick, the blade barely cooled before it was summoned again. Every decision Henry made cast a shadow for decades, and Mary was one of his most complex legacies. In his lifetime, Henry VIII loved his daughter, but he loved power and his own belief system even more. When Henry divorced Mary's mother, Catherine of Aragon, he also divorced the bond between father and daughter. Mary, once a legitimate princess, was declared a bastard, exiled to cold castles, and forbidden from seeing her mother. It left a scar that never healed. When Henry died in 1547, England was blanketed in a chill not just from royal mourning, but from uncertainty. The legitimate heir was young Edward VI, son of Henry and Jane Seymour, only 9 years old. Mary was still alive, carrying with her a deep wound, a fierce Catholic faith, and a memory that never faded of being disowned by her own father. If you think things got easier from there, I'm sorry you wouldn't have survived. Because Henry's legacy, religious division, political marriages, and an obsession with succession had created a deeply fractured England, where anyone could be toppled, beheaded, or worse, forgotten. Henry VIII. The man infamous for 6 marriages is often remembered for his wives. But it's easy to overlook that he was also the architect of one of Europe's most chaotic dynasties. When he died on January 28, 1547, it wasn't an ending. It was a ticking time bomb. Henry departed at 55, his body decayed by disease, his mind heavy with guilt and choices he never truly took responsibility for. In his final years, he could barely walk, hoisted out of bed with pulleys, while royal physicians dared not speak the truth about his health after all, who wanted their head rolling on cold stone. Even organizing his funeral proved difficult as his body decayed too quickly. Some accounts say his coffin leaked fluid so much that someone remarked he was giving his blood back to England. A bitter joke, but perhaps a fitting end for a man who spilled so much of it. Edward VI. His son took the throne in a time of chaos, but Edward was just a boy, brilliant, educated, but highly susceptible to manipulation. And the adults around him didn't hesitate to exploit that. Henry left his son a kingdom divided half Catholic, half Protestant, with a restless population and nobles hungrier for power than for grain. The Tudor dynasty under Henry had become a game of power with no room for mercy. So, if Henry died quietly yet left behind a storm, what would Edward and later Mary do with that legacy? An England with no more saints, no more certainties, and no one left to fear but the ones who wore the crown. Close your eyes and imagine the church bells tolling not just to summon the faithful, but to announce the hour of burning heretics. The sky above places like Smithfield, once bustling marketplaces, now choked with smoke and the scent of charred flesh. One by one, those accused of defying Catholic doctrine were dragged into the streets, and before crowds of onlookers, reduced to ash. More than 280 people were burned in just 4 years of reign. Among them were scholars, clergymen, even pregnant women. To Mary, this was a necessary purification. To the public, it became a haunting. And from that, the nickname Bloody Mary was born. But not everyone agreed. Historians still debate whether Mary was truly bloodthirsty or merely a pawn swept up by political tides and unwavering devotion to her faith. She was not the first monarch to execute heretics. Her father, Henry VIII, had done the same. And what Elizabeth, her half-sister, would go on to do was no less ruthless. But because Mary was a woman, because she was a Catholic ruling over a nation shifting toward Protestantism, or simply because history is often harsher to those who lose, whatever the reason, Mary never escaped that name, and her reign remained stained in English memory. And now you understand why Mary has not been a popular name for daughters in English families since the 16th century. When Mary came to power, one obsession consumed her: to restore Catholicism and cleanse England of the heresy of Protestantism, the very thing her father Henry VIII had sown and her brother Edward VI had nurtured. In Mary's eyes, this was not mere politics. It was a divine mission. And to fulfill it, she believed she had to use fire literally. These heretics were seen as sparks, spreading corruption through the soul fields of England. And she, like a desperate gardener, carried her torch from weed to weed. The heresy trials began. Protestants, from poor peasants to powerful bishops, were dragged before the courts and sentenced to die. Fire consumed priests, lay people, and the soft-spoken voices of dissent. In just 5 brief years, over 280 people were burned alive, most at Smithfield, where today only a small plaque marks the spot in central London. People began whispering the name Bloody Mary, not because they understood all the politics, but because the smell of scorched flesh and human ash still clung to the evening wind. Historians remain divided. Was Mary a blind zealot or a queen pushed to the brink? Some say she was a victim of an age where softness meant death, especially for a woman ruling after centuries of male monarchs. Others see her as a ruler who lost her humanity to religious idealism, so committed to belief that she was willing to burn her own people for it. The irony is cruel. Her father, Henry VIII, had killed many to break from Rome, and now his daughter was killing to return. Under Mary's reign, there was not only blood, but also attempts at reform. She reopened ties with the Vatican, restored the monasteries, and reinstated Catholic rituals in churches. But the hearts of the people had changed. English hymns, prayers without the need for priestly mediation, these had become their new habits. And now they were forced to return to the past with whip and sword. Mary could change the laws, but she couldn't change hearts. Inside the palace, Mary faced profound loneliness. She married King Philip II of Spain, a political alliance more than a romance. Philip did not love Mary, nor was he truly interested in the English crown. When Philip left, Mary sank into depression. Worse still, she believed she was pregnant, and the entire court believed it too. But months passed, and her belly did not grow. Doctors were baffled, and Mary was devastated. Many later believed it was a case of phantom pregnancy, or worse, a tumor. Not long after, Philip married someone else, and Mary was left drained of health and of hope. In the winter of 1558, she lay bedridden, silent, aching, and finally surrendering. When Mary died, there were no thousands weeping in the streets. No grand funeral like her father's. Only a quiet sigh of relief from those who had survived her flames. But history, ever the grand ironist, kept one thing the name. Mary Tudor, the forsaken daughter, the woman who tried to restore faith and redeem her nation's soul, is forever remembered by one chilling title, Bloody Mary. And as if that weren't enough, posterity turned her name into a mirror game where children summoned the ghost of a blood-soaked woman. So, was she truly a demon in a crimson gown? Or just a lonely soul trying to restore order in a kingdom unraveling? Tonight, if you close your eyes and happen to see a flicker behind the curtain, remember, it may not be a ghost, but the echo of a queen still yearning to be understood. Sleep well.